In a world different to the one we live in today, a world distinctly divided along two powers, the Western capitalists and the Eastern communists, a stark divide is most evident on the European continent, where the continent stands divided by an impenetrable barrier separating the capitalist Westerners from the communist Easterners. Few were allowed to cross the barrier, with stringent requirements needing to be met to cross the impenetrable Iron Curtain. But unbeknownst to the West, an invasion was on its way from the core of the enemy deep within the Soviet Union, an invasion like none other, one that will go on to affect millions of people in the West and catch the Western capitalists completely off guard and leaving millions of unsuspecting Westerners addicted. This creation would bring the massively wealthy British tycoon Robert Maxwell to face off against a small-time video game trader based in Japan by the name of Henk Rogers, in what would become a David vs Goliath clash, the outcome of which would have far-reaching consequences, deciding the fate of two of the biggest gaming companies in the world at the time, sworn enemies Atari and Nintendo, who faced off in a legal battle over a dispute that involved millions of dollars. This is the story of how a simple game of fitting pieces together grew to be massively influential and achieved the near impossible feat of successfully crossing the Iron Curtain, reaching millions of capitalists despite being made in communist Russia. This is the story of Tetris. The year is 1985. The Cold War still rages on and Europe is divided by the Iron Curtain. America and the Soviets are competing with one another in a bid to outdo the other, with the most notable competition being the space race that occurred in the 50s up until the mid-70s. Continuing on from the space race, the focus in the West and the East still remained scientific progression. The race for scientific supremacy spawned research labs like Bell Labs and Darpa in the US, which were largely responsible for technology such as radar and the internet, while within the Soviet Union, several research labs were created which explored scientific advancements, resulting in the invention of satellites and many other brilliant innovations. It was at one of these Soviet research facilities that a young engineer hired to work for the Darpa Computer Center doing computing testing found inspiration to create a revolutionary game. At this research facility, scientists pushed machines to the very edge of their capabilities. Alexei Pajitnov was a scientist at the research center whose job it was to write software programs that tested the computing capabilities of various machines within the Soviet Union. While conducting tests on these machines, he had an inkling of an idea to write a program that extended the machines far beyond their usual use. Growing up in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, Alexei barely had any games to play. The most easily accessible games were chess and various other types of board games, among which was Alexei's favorite childhood game, Pentominoes, which was quite popular in the Soviet Union. It is a game that consists of 12 different shapes made out of 5 squares, where the player is tasked with arranging the pieces so that they fit perfectly into a rectangular box. While working on a computer in the spring of 1985, Alexei started to explore the idea of creating a digital version of his favorite childhood game. He made changes to the original game. The 5 square pieces of Pentominoes became 4 square pieces, and instead of having to fit them in a box, they fell to the bottom of the screen, where it was the job of the player to rotate the shapes and fit them together. And just like that, he had created a new game, which he called Tetris, from the Greek word for 4. He shared the game with a few co-workers, and soon the entire computer center was hooked on the game. The first version of Tetris didn't have color or sound effects, and more importantly, didn't have levels or a scoring mechanism. But even in its crude first version, it proved to be quite the hit with the computer center. Soon after creating the first version, Alexei worked with fellow programmers to create a color version of the game. It was this version that he would hand out to people outside the computer center. The game began to have a huge player base within the Soviet Union, as people would copy the game and share it with their friends, who would in turn repeat the very same process. What made the game so addictive and a massive hit in the Soviet Union was its clever design. As you played the game and fit pieces properly, completed rows would disappear, and when the game ended, you'd only be able to see the rows you failed to complete. It exploited the parts of the human psychology that seeks completion. The uncomfortable feeling brought on by not completing arranging the Tetris pieces properly would lead the player to play one more time, believing that this time they would fit all the pieces perfectly, prompting the release of the dopamine that comes with a job well done. And it is that very surge of dopamine that guarantees that even if you complete a level, you will keep coming back to the game to feel a sense of completion once more. It was a really simple game that struck at the core of an innate psychological need, which is the need for completion. What also helped the game spread like wildfire was the communist system within the USSR. In the Soviet Union, there was no notion of intellectual property rights. All individual ideas were owned by the state. So within the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc countries, the game was being shared freely without the fear of copyright infringement. It had no protections put on it to prevent piracy. These lack of restrictions on sharing software helped the game proliferate to millions of users spread across the Soviet Union. The only thing at this point that contained the spread of Tetris was the Iron Curtain, the impenetrable barrier set up to stop people from crossing in and out of the capitalist West. But the Iron Curtain would not contain Tetris for too long. Tetris eventually found its way to Hungary, a Soviet satellite state which had been successfully exporting puzzle games and computer technology to the West. There was a booming industry of middlemen who traveled to Soviet satellite states, licensing technology from the East and then going on to sell it on in the West for a handsome profit. Among these middlemen was a man by the name Robert Stein. He had built a successful business called Andromeda Software, which licensed Hungarian software products to sell in Great Britain for a sizable profit. On one of his trips to Hungary, Stein came across Tetris. Keen to know more about the software, he asked about the creator of the game. The Hungarians brushed aside his inquiries in the hope that they could sell him other software products that they had made. After some persistence from Stein, the Hungarians reluctantly revealed that Tetris wasn't their own creation, but rather that it had originated from within the Soviet Union, specifically Russia. They gave Robert Stein the name of the computing center from which it had spawned out of. He immediately contacted the center to license the game, but the center wasn't at all interested in his proposal. The computer center was more focused on advancing science within the Soviet Union and not the commercialization of its work, much less a game that had nothing to do with the fundamental research that was happening at the center. Eventually, Stein's proposal would reach Alexei Pajitnov, the creator of the game. He replied to Stein that the center was interested in his proposal. Stein proposed to pay an advance of £10,000 for the game and a future royalty from its sales. Stein interpreted the interest from Alexei as an agreement to his proposal, so under the assumption that he had the licensing right to Tetris, Stein wasted no time shopping his license around to big-time British game producers, one of which was Microsoft, the software arm of Maxwell Corporation. In 1986, the Maxwell Corporation was a giant entertainment empire. It owned newspapers, magazines, and football clubs, among other business ventures. If Maxwell bought into Tetris, Robert Stein would have an industry giant with expertise behind the game. Microsoft signed a deal with Stein to have the production rights of the game in Great Britain and the United States. For the Western gaming audience, Tetris stood in stark contrast to the first-person shooter games, tank battle-themed games, which emphasized explosions, chases, and using weapons to defeat an opponent. Tetris was the complete opposite of that. The game was painfully different from everything else on the Western gaming market at the time. But it had one big advantage. The game had proven addictive within the Soviet Union, which meant it was guaranteed that if people bought the game, they would not be disappointed with their purchases. The main problem then was how to convince Western consumers to buy the game. Because the game was the complete opposite of everything on the market, rather than trying to market it like other games, which it was nothing like, inspiration for its marketing efforts was drawn from the roots of the game, the Soviet Union. Westerners feared the Soviet Union, but also had a deep fascination with it, so the game's marketing played into the fascination element of the Westerners' imagination of the land that lay on the other side of the Iron Curtain. The game was put in red packaging and spelt in Russian. It included the Soviet hammer and sickle as part of its branding. The marketing was genius. The blatant Soviet branding created massive press coverage and elicited a reaction from people who had their interest piqued, but all the attention had an unforeseen consequence that threatened to put a halt on everything. As Microsoft prepared to launch Tetris, Andromeda Software received a legal notice from an organization called ELOG notifying the corporation that it was illegally trying to launch Tetris because the game belonged to them and they had not given anyone permission to launch the game. During the Cold War, trade between the Soviet Union and the West existed, but it was under strict government control. It was done through specific government departments. ILOG was one of these departments, set up to specifically deal with the export of Soviet software products to the West. Stein tried to plead his case, stating that he hadn't been aware of the existence of ILOG and pointing out that he thought he legally licensed Tetris. Eventually, he was able to persuade the Russians to sign a contract that gave him the legal right to commercialize Tetris in the West. This paved the path for Stein and Microsoft to launch the game without any problems. Just weeks after officially securing the rights to Tetris, it became a bestseller and sold more than 100,000 copies within its first year of release in America alone. At this point in time, copies of the game were only available for personal computer users. This presented a massive opportunity for Tetris to expand into other device segments. Home video games played through gaming consoles that plugged directly into a TV and were played using game controllers were rising in popularity. Tetris publisher Microsoft saw this massive opportunity and entered into a deal with Atari to create a console version of Tetris. Apart from entering other device segments, Tetris still had one more market to conquer, a market so big that for most of the early 80s, its economy was predicted to surpass that of the United States and become the biggest economy in the world. That market was Japan. Henk Rogers was an entrepreneur who saw the size of the Japanese market and set up a business that searched for games all over the world to then license and sell in the Japanese market. It was at an American trade show where Henk came across Atari representatives who were showcasing Tetris on their newest console. He immediately secured the rights for the PC and video game console versions of Tetris for the Japanese market. He commercialized the game in Japan to great success. Through various sub-licensing deals, manufacturing and publishing agreements, many companies had made millions from the success of Tetris, and everyone was quite happy except the Soviets. ILOG had yet to see any financial benefit from the game and drafted in a high-ranking party official named Nikolai Belikov to figure out why ILOG had yet to see any financial earnings from the commercial success of Tetris. He re-examined the original agreement ILOG had made with Robert Stein's company, Andromeda Software. Upon reading the contract, he saw that it stipulated that the first payment following the licensing of Tetris would have to be made within 3 months of the date of the licensing agreement. It had been over 5 months since the agreement was struck. Thus, Andromeda Software was in violation of the agreement. He began thinking of ways to force Andromeda to pay the money ILOG was owed. As it would turn out, it would take the release of a revolutionary new handheld to achieve his goal. The industry giant Nintendo was gearing up to launch a handheld game-playing device and wanted to sell Tetris as part of the package, but they needed someone to discreetly get them the rights to Tetris without alerting their competitors. The handheld device Nintendo was working on was called the Game Boy, and they demonstrated a prototype of the device playing Tetris to Henk Rogers. Henk Rogers moved quickly to try and secure handheld rights for Tetris. He contacted Robert Stein to be his representative to get the rights to Tetris for handheld devices. Stein agreed, and Henk Rogers sent him $25,000 to secure his services. But at the same time, Stein was discussing the very same rights with Microsoft. Henk Rogers frequently exchanged communications with Robert Stein about the securing of the handheld rights for Tetris, but Stein kept stalling. Months went by, and Rogers increasingly got worried. Robert Stein had been in contact with ILOG but faced a major hurdle in the negotiations for the handheld rights. ILOG wanted him to pay them the money he owed them under their previous agreement for the licensing of Tetris on PCs. Henk Rogers could sense that Stein wasn't completely upfront with him. Fearing that he might lose out on the rights, he decided to fly to Moscow on his own and negotiate the handheld rights for Tetris. Coincidentally, in that same week that Henk Rogers flew to Moscow, Robert Stein himself had decided to make a trip to Russia, and at around the same time, Microsoft had secretly sent Kevin Maxwell, the son of Robert Maxwell. Both Stein and Maxwell had meetings scheduled on the same day. Henk, on the other hand, didn't even have a meeting set. He didn't even have an address for the offices of ILOG. He just hoped that he would figure out everything when he got there. Well, immediately after landing, the true difficulty of the task at hand presented itself. This was the other side of the Iron Curtain. The people were reserved and unfriendly, particularly to Westerners. He asked many people for help to find Ilog, but all of them simply said they didn't know or didn't bother to even answer his question. So he resorted to hiring an interpreter who was finally able to locate Ilog for Henk Rogers. Uninvited, Henk Rogers headed to Ilog seeking to speak with someone who could grant him the rights for handheld Tetris. His unannounced visit violated the strict protocols of the Soviet Union, which required notification months before a visit, along with supporting documents in order to get official permission from the government to organize a meeting with Ilog. This was done to ensure that all background checks were conducted on individuals, properly vetting them to determine whether or not they were foreign agents of the West. Somehow, despite this massive violation, Rogers negotiated a meeting for the next day, the same day as Stein and Kevin Maxwell. Nikolai Belikov had cleverly set all the meetings on the same day to hear the proposals of the three parties and pit them against each other for the rights of handheld Tetris. On the big day of the meetings, the first person to arrive for a meeting was Henk Rogers, holding in his hand proudly the Japanese version of Tetris, to which Nikolai Belikov said that Ilog had not given anyone the video game console publishing rights for Tetris. Henk attempted to explain the chain of companies that he went through to get the rights to Tetris, which involved Microsoft, who in turn had gotten the rights from Andromeda Software, but Belikov said the only rights that were transferred to Andromeda were the personal computer rights to Tetris, and informed him that he was illegally selling something that doesn't belong to him. So within a few minutes of the meeting convening, Henk went from seeking additional rights to Tetris to facing the prospects that the rights he had for the video game console for Tetris in Japan were worthless. Belikov hastily arranged a meeting with Henk for the next day to avoid Henk bumping into Robert Stein in the corridors of Ilog. Narrowly missing Henk Rogers, Robert Stein arrived at the Ilog offices. Stein was confronted with the original agreement he had signed with Ilog and asked about the missing payments that were owed to Ilog. He tried to propose a new agreement, but Belikov, wanting to hear Kevin Maxwell's pitch, decided to dismiss Stein and schedule a new meeting on the following day, just as he had done with Henk Rogers. Kevin Maxwell was the son of Robert Maxwell, who at the time was one of the richest men in the world. Robert Maxwell had very good connections within the Soviet Union ruling brass, connections that reached up to the very top. Kevin Maxwell was clearly in the most powerful position to negotiate the rights. Nikolai Belikov brought up Henk's cartridge, which showed that he got the rights of the video game console Tetris for Japan from Microsoft. Belikov pointed out that he had not given video game console rights to anyone, so he asked Kevin Maxwell where Microsoft got those rights from. Kevin Maxwell, unaware that Microsoft had made a deal with Atari to license them video game console rights for Tetris, said Henk's Tetris was a pirate version of Tetris and that Microsoft didn't have the rights to video game console Tetris, so he proposed to make an offer for the console rights for Tetris after he got back to Great Britain. Unintentionally, Maxwell had just put Atari's upcoming Tetris release in jeopardy. Had he stated that Andromeda Software had licensed them the right to video game console Tetris, maybe the following events would have gone differently. The next day, Belikov added new clauses to the original agreement that was signed with Robert Stein. He added a clause that explicitly stated that video game consoles and other devices were not included in the licensing of Tetris for personal computers, and then convinced Robert Stein to sign the agreement. Stein, eager to get handheld rights, signed the document without checking for any changes. He had just unwittingly signed away the possible right for Tetris on video game consoles, because theoretically, he could have argued in a court of law that a video game console is encompassed in the definition of what a computer is. That is specifically why Belikov had to make him sign a new agreement that specifically limited the definition of a computer to that of a personal computer. Had he not done that, Microsoft could have legally maintained the right to the license for the video game console of Tetris, which they had sold to Atari. But now that Andromeda Software explicitly didn't have video game console rights, it meant Microsoft didn't have them too, and consequently, Atari no longer had the right to make a version of Tetris for their console. With Stein out of the way, Belikov had to decide between Kevin Maxwell and Henk Rogers for the rights of handheld Tetris. Henk enlisted the help of Alexei Pajitnov, the creator of Tetris, in trying to convince Ilog to grant him the rights for handheld Tetris. His approach worked. Ilog gave him the rights for handheld Tetris. Nikolai Belikov then told Henk Rogers that he would like him to make an offer on the console rights for Tetris. Tetris, but there was going to be a massive battle for the console rights. Atari had already been manufacturing console versions of Tetris through an agreement with Microsoft. Atari had hundreds of thousands of copies of Tetris already sitting on shelves, but they were about to receive a rude awakening. Henk knew that he was up against a media giant in Microsoft, so he headed to Seattle, the American headquarters of Nintendo, to enlist their help in securing the rights for the console version of Tetris. With Nintendo behind him, he could easily match the industry power of Microsoft. Nintendo at the time had the best-selling video game console in the world. Atari and Nintendo were arch rivals, and Nintendo now had a chance to snatch console Tetris rights right from underneath the nose of their biggest competitor. Nintendo offered full support to help Henk Rogers secure the rights for console Tetris. Meanwhile in Britain, the entertainment tycoon Robert Maxwell found out that his son had lost out on the rights to handle Tetris and immediately started contacting his senior connections within the Soviet Union political establishment. Higher ups within the Kremlin began putting pressure on Nikolai Belakov and threatened his position. Henk sensed that he was running out of time to secure the rights of console Tetris, so he organized for himself and Howard Lincoln, the chairman of Nintendo America, to secretly travel to Moscow to secure the deal. The plan needed to happen in secret to avoid alerting Atari that they were about to lose their Tetris console rights to an arch rival. So Howard Lincoln told everyone at Nintendo that he was traveling to Japan for a routine business trip so as to not arouse any suspicion. In Moscow, Rogers and Lincoln struck a deal that guaranteed $500,000 in royalties to Elog and 50 cents from every copy of Tetris that was sold. This was 30 times what Robert Stein had offered. Immediately after securing the rights, Nintendo sent a cease and desist letter to Atari to halt its launch of Tetris for their console because they didn't have the licensing rights to do so. Atari at this time had invested millions of dollars in the manufacturing of the game cartridges of Tetris and had also heavily marketed Tetris ahead of its launch for the Atari console. So rather than accept Nintendo's cease and desist letter, they decided to fight back, responding with a lawsuit. Unfortunately for Atari, when the issue went to court, the judge issued an injunction barring Atari from further distributing the game and further ordered all existing copies of the game to be destroyed. As a result, 268,000 Tetris cartridges for the Atari console were recalled and destroyed after only 4 weeks on shelves, costing Atari millions of dollars in losses. Nintendo wasted no time capitalizing on their new license, selling over 8 million copies of Tetris for the NES, making millions of dollars in profit. In addition to this, Tetris was key to the success of the Nintendo Game Boy. Tetris for the Game Boy would go on to sell over 35 million copies, further solidifying Nintendo's dominance over arch rival Atari. By the time Atari figured out that the blame lay on Microsoft, who had sold them rights they didn't have, it was too late. On the 5th of November 1991, the billionaire tycoon owner of the company, Robert Maxwell, mysteriously disappeared while on his yacht, leaving a company ravished with debt that left a lot of questions unanswered, leaving Atari to pay the price for the bad deal it had made. Tetris would go on to be named one of the greatest video games of all time. By December 2011, it had sold 202 million copies, approximately 70 million physical units, and 132 million paid mobile game downloads, making it one of the best-selling video game franchises ever. It is quite crazy to think that at some point in the Cold War, the most popular game on both sides of the Iron Curtain was Tetris. Thank you for watching.